Welcome to Sigma Tech Learning Hub. I will be your instructor for agricultural science. For this class, we are going to be taking our exercises from the ExamGuide app. If you don't have the application already installed on your device, I will want you to download the app in order to follow along in this class. ExamGuide is the leading educational app that helps students prepare adequately for various exams like UTME, post-UTME, WAEC, GCE, KCPE, IJMB, JUPEB, Cowbellpedia, BECE, JSCE, NCEE, NECO, to mention a few. You can download the app from www.examguide.com or Google Play Store. Please subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell to be updated on new videos. Ready for today's class? Okay, let's get started. In order to be able to rear a particular farm animal or to raise a particular crop, a good understanding of how the animals or plant relates to its environment is needed. Now, the study of this relationship between the animal or the plant with its environment constitutes what is known as agricultural ecology. So in this lesson, we will look at the meaning and importance of agricultural ecology. So our topic for today is meaning and importance of agricultural ecology. And by the end of this lesson, you should be able to state the meaning of agricultural ecology, define population, community, habitat, and biosphere, which are basic concepts of ecology. You should also be able to explain terrestrial and aquatic habitat. And finally, you should be able to highlight the ecosystem and its components. So what is the meaning of agricultural ecology and ecosystem? That's what we're going to look at now. So the word ecology comes from the Greek word oikos, meaning dwelling place or home. So ecology studies living organisms in their natural dwelling place. Now, what is the meaning of agricultural ecology? Now, agricultural ecology can be defined as the study of living organisms, which include crops and farm animals, in relation to their environment. So we're talking about the relationship between living organisms and their environment. So it's also known as environment biology. Now, the basic ecological concepts here we're going to look at now are population, community, biosphere, and habitat. Now, we're going to look at the meaning of population. What is population? Now, this is the number of organisms of the same kind that are living together in a particular place and at a particular time. We also have community. What is community? Now, the community refers to different populations living together in a particular place, different populations of living organisms living together in a particular place. While biosphere refers to the part of the earth where life exists. So any part of the earth where life exists is called the biosphere. Now, habitat is defined as the natural dwelling place of an organism, and here we have what is called the aquatic habitat and the terrestrial habitat. The aquatic habitat is known as water-dwelling habitat, then the terrestrial habitat is the land-dwelling habitat. So the aquatic habitat refers to water-dwelling habitats such as puddles, ponds, streams, and flooded farmland. And the terrestrial habitat refers to land-dwelling habitats such as the bush, the farmland, the forest, and the deserts. Now, the terrestrial habitat can be divided into three levels. We have what is the ground level, the arboreal, and the underground level. Now, the ground level, of course, we know has to do with the surface of the earth, and arboreal has to do with located on trees, that's in trees or on trees. So when you hear arboreal, we're referring to trees, on trees or in trees, a habitat located in trees or on trees. Then we also have underground that has to do with being below the surface of the earth. Let's take a look at the branches of agricultural ecology. Here we have two main branches. The first is horticology, the second is synecology. Now, what is horticology? As a branch of agricultural ecology, it has to do with the study of an individual organism or a single species of an organism and its environment. Remember, we talked about ecology being the study of the relationship between living organisms and the environment, but in this case, horticology has to do with just a single individual organism or a single species and its environment. For example, a single cattle and its environment. You're studying a single cattle and its environment. The second branch here is synecology, and this has to do with the study of the interrelationship between group of organisms. Here is not a single organism, but group of organisms or species of organisms living together in an area. An example of synecology is when you study different fishes in a fish pond in relation to the aquatic environment or habitat. Now let's take a look at the meaning of an ecosystem. What's an ecosystem? This refers to a community of crop plants and farm animals functioning together with their non-living environment. So here we're taking note of the word non-living environment. Let's take a look at the importance of agricultural ecology. How is agricultural ecology important? One, it helps us to understand agricultural crops and animal behavior in their natural environment. It also helps us to understand how agricultural crops and animals live and survive in a particular habitat from generation to generation. So we talked about how they behave in their natural environment, how they live and survive in their natural habitat, and it also helps us, it's also important in the fact that it enables us to know the unfavorable effects of industrialization. Now, of course, when you talk about industrialization, we're talking about release of gases that are not friendly to the ecosystem, and so the effect of this industrialization on vegetation, rivers, and the air of our untapped natural resources, and how we are able to avoid any future mishap that may occur as a result of this industrialization. So that's another importance of agricultural ecology. And it also helps us to solve future problems in relation to land use and management. It also assists us or helps us to establish a more healthy and long-term balance between both the wild plants and animals and the domestic plants and animals. Domestic means those that have been tamed under the control of man, while wild means they're just existing on their own in the wild. So it helps us to establish a more healthy and long-term balance between the wild and domestic plants and animals in their environment. And it also enables us to understand better control of the spread of pests and diseases, not only just as it affects man, but also as it affects our domestic animals and also our field and stored agricultural crops. It also helps us to know how we can relate each organisms to each other, irrespective or regardless of their characteristics. So it helps us to know how we can relate each organism to each other in the environment, regardless of the characteristics of these various organisms. It also helps us to know how to preserve life, especially as regards endangered species. So we're able to talk about the issue of poaching to control it. That's illegal killing of endangered species of animals that could possibly go into extinction. Let's look at this components of the farm or a farm ecosystem. So what are the components? Components means what it's made up of. So we have the farm ecosystem is made up of two main components. We have the biotic and the abiotic. So biotic has to do with the living components. Abiotic has to do with the non-living components. So look at the biotic component. Now, this is the living part of the ecosystem, and it includes plants and animals. And some of these plants are producers, like the green plants, which can be grouped into two classes. Here we have the autotropism and heterotrophism. So we get to understand better what autotropism is and heterotropism. Now, autotropism, remember we're talking about the biotic component, which is the living part of life. Here, autotropism has to do with the process whereby an organism uses sunlight or chemicals to manufacture their food. So here, an organism is a process. Take note of that. Autotropism is a process whereby an organism uses sunlight, which is solar energy, or chemicals to manufacture their own food. And the organisms that do this are called autotrophs, or they're also called producers. Now, autotrophs, we take note that autotrophs are self-sustaining members of the ecosystem. And what do? They synthesize, that's combine some elements to produce, to bring about a product. They help to synthesize complex organic compounds, and these compounds are like carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, from simple inorganic molecules with the help of sunlight or inorganic chemical energy. Inorganic chemical reactions, sorry. Now, based on this method of synthesizing their food, these autotrophs can be further divided or further classified into two categories. We have the phototrophs and we have the chemoautotrophs. I said we have the phototrophs and the chemoautotrophs. So what are phototrophs? Phototrophs are mostly plants that use light as a source of energy to make their own food, while chemoautotrophs are the bacteria or the fungi that obtain their food by inorganic chemical reaction. Let's look at heterotrophism. Remember, we've talked about autotrophism. Now we're looking at heterotrophism. Remember, I said autotrophism is a process by which organisms manufacture their own food. But in this case, heterotrophism has to do with organisms, mainly farm animals, which cannot manufacture their own food. So you need to take note of that. They cannot manufacture their own food, but they depend either directly or indirectly on plants, which are the producers, or the autotrophs, for their food. So they depend directly or indirectly on plants for their food. So this process is called heterotrophism. And the organisms that depend on plants, or the organisms that carry out heterotrophism, are called heterotrophs. They are also called consumers. Okay? Now this illustration of this picture helps us to understand heterotrophism or heterotrophs, the relationship between autotrophs and heterotrophs. You can see the plant, which is a producer, as an autotroph, makes use of sunlight to manufacture its food, and the grasshopper now feeds on the plant directly. Remember, from our definition, we said the heterotrophs, or heterotrophism, is where the organism obtains, the process by which an organism obtains its food, either directly or indirectly, from the autotrophs or the producers. So the grasshopper, which is a consumer now, obtains the food from the plant, which is a producer. And moving up, you can see that the bird feeds on the grasshopper. So that bird is also obtaining energy indirectly from the plant by feeding on the grasshopper. Then we also have the snake consuming the bird, and we have the owl consuming the snake. So from this is actually a food chain that shows the transfer of energy from one organism to the other. It also helps us to understand heterotrophism. So you can see the other organism, the bird, the snake, and the owl, by consuming each other, indirectly get their energy from the plant, while the grasshopper directly gets its energy from the plant. Now let's take a look at the abiotic components of an ecosystem, and this has to do with the non-living things which exist in the ecosystem. And here we're going to look at the climatic factors, inorganic materials and nutrients, edaphic factors, and other factors. So what are the climatic factors? Which are things like the temperature, wind, humidity, sunlight, and rainfall. These are climatic factors, and they belong to the non-living components or the abiotic components of an ecosystem. We also have inorganic materials and nutrients such as carbon dioxide, oxygen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus. We also have the edaphic factors like soil, rocks, and topography. And finally, we also have other factors like dust, storm, fire, and wind. All of these have a role to play in the ecosystem, and they belong to what is called the abiotic components, which are the non-living components of an ecosystem. So let's look at the interaction of these components, that's between the living components and non-living components. Looking at this, we're going to take a look at the terrestrial habitat. Here we're looking at mixed farming, and in mixed farming, there's an interaction between the living and the non-living components there. That's the biotic and the abiotic. Here, what is mixed farming now? This is the land environment where we have plants and animals. Now, in mixed farming, it involves the cultivation of crops and also rearing of animals simultaneously on the same piece of land. Of course, the land probably divided into plots where a portion can be used for raising animals, another portion for growing plants. But mixed farming involves the cultivation of crops and rearing of animals simultaneously on the same piece of land. Now, the grasses or the remains of the crops, that's looking at the interaction. Now, the grasses or the remains of crops can serve as food for the animals, while the animal dung or droppings, which is the waste released from the animals after digestion has taken place, their poo, which is called dung or droppings when it comes to animals, but for feces, are used as organic manure, which can help to improve the fertility of the soil. So you can see the interaction between the biotic and the abiotic. The soil, which is an edaphic factor, the fertility of the soil can be improved as a result of the animal dungs or droppings that are deposited on the soil. Then we also have both the animals and the crops release carbon dioxide during respiration. And this carbon dioxide can be used or is used by plants for photosynthesis. Of course, we know what photosynthesis is, the process by which plants manufacture their food in the presence of sunlight. Carbon dioxide is one of the elements that is needed by plants as they manufacture their food or as they carry out photosynthesis. Now, crop plants also release oxygen to the atmosphere during the process of photosynthesis, and this oxygen is taken up by the animals during photosynthesis by the plants. The oxygen is now taken up by the animals. Okay, let's look at another interaction of the components of an ecosystem. Here we're looking at a fish pond, which is an aquatic habitat. Let's look at the interaction of the biotic and the abiotic factors or components in a fish pond. Now, what is the fish pond? Is a water or aquatic environment where fishes, they live, they grow, they produce, and they are harvested for our food or for commercial purposes. And not only fishes grow in the aquatic habitat, we have crabs, periwinkles, some other planktons or oysters, to mention a few. Now, the fishes feed on planktons, which are microscopic plants, in the water as a source of their food. And when these fishes die, they could serve as manure. When they decompose, they serve as manure for these microscopic plants, which are planktons in the water. And we also need to note another reaction or interaction is that the planktons, which are microscopic plants, and the fishes do release carbon dioxide to the aquatic habitat. which aids photosynthesis. And the planktons, which are microscopic plants or microscopic algae, use this carbon dioxide and water to also make their food and also release oxygen, which aids respiration of the fishes in the water or aquatic habitat or in the pond. Now, the planktons also make use of sunlight. Sunlight is needed during photosynthesis, so this plankton makes use of sunlight during photosynthesis to manufacture their food. Sunlight is an abiotic component, you know. The planktons is a biotic component, so the relationship here now is that the planktons make use of the sunlight during photosynthesis to manufacture their food. Then the fish dungs or droppings also provide a source of nutrients to the planktons in the water, and this also enhances vegetative growth, which helps to moderate pond temperature. So the water there is an abiotic component too, you know. So the planktons are, once the fish dungs or their droppings, which is their feces or their waste, is deposited in the water, it can enhance vegetative growth, and this helps to moderate pond temperature. So we need to take note of that as well. Now, another interaction of the components in an ecosystem has to do with what is called mono or sole cropping, which is in a terrestrial habitat. Now, what is monocropping or sole cropping? It has to do with the continuous planting of one particular crop on a piece of land year after year. The planting of one particular crop on a piece of land year after year. And an example of monocropping, which if it's done year after year, can also become monoculture, especially if it's the same crop. An example is as seen in orchards, which are for growing of fruits, and plantations as well. Now, what is the relationship or the interaction between the biotic, which is the living factor component, and the abiotic component in an ecosystem here concerning mono or sole cropping? Here we can see that the crop plants, which is the living component, absorb nutrients from the soil, which is the non-living component. That's an interaction. The crop plants, which is also a living component, absorbs water, which is a non-living factor or component or an abiotic component, to grow and produce fruits. That's an interaction. The crop plants also absorb carbon dioxide. Crop plant, living component or biotic factor, carbon dioxide, abiotic factor. So the crop plants absorb carbon dioxide from the air to carry out photosynthesis. We're looking at the interactions between the components, which has to do with the living component, which is the abiotic factor, and the non-living component. Sorry, the living component, which is the biotic factor, and the non-living component, which is the abiotic factors, the interaction and their effects. Now, we also have crop residues. They do decay, and once they decay with the aid of microorganisms, they also release nutrients into the soil. That's another relationship or interaction. While some organisms which are in the soil, for example, we have some organisms that are in the soil. Remember, in the terrestrial habitat, I said there are different levels. We have on the surface, on top of trees, such as arboreal, then we have underground. Now, the organisms I'm referring here to are underground earthworms, and even some rodents which are on the surface of the soil. They perforate the soil, and this could help, that's digging holes into the soil. This could help water or aid water percolation, that's the downward movement of water into the soil, which will help the roots of plants water to get to the roots of plants. Then, and also help aeration too, as a result of the pore spaces they are making in the soil, which also helps growth of plants because the roots will also be able to breathe properly. Then we also have crop plants release oxygen to the atmosphere during respiration. Let's look at another illustration that shows the interaction of the components of an ecosystem. Here we're looking at mixed cropping system, which is a terrestrial the terrestrial habitat. Now, the mixed cropping system, this involves the growing of 2 or more crops on the same piece of land at the same time during the same season. It involves the growing of 2 or more crops on the same piece of land at the same time during the same season. Now, what is the interaction here between the biotic and the abiotic components in a mixed cropping system? Crops like cowpea, they add nutrients to the soil. So the crops, which is a biotic component, adds nutrients to the soil, which is an abiotic component. The crops also obtain nutrients from the soil. Crops like cassava and other arable food crops obtain nutrients from the soil. That's the crop is a biotic component, while the soil is an abiotic component, and edaphic factor specifically. Then the crops also release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere during respiration. That's another interaction between the biotic and the abiotic components in a mixed cropping system. We also have carbon dioxide from the air is now absorbed by the crop plants. And why do they make use of it? What do they do with that carbon dioxide? To manufacture their own food through the process called photosynthesis. Now, oxygen is also released to the atmosphere by the crop plants during photosynthesis. So we're seeing the interaction now. Oxygen is an abiotic factor released by the plants, which is a biotic factor. That's an interaction. We also have that the leaves of the crop plants which fall down, when they decay, they do add nutrients to the soil through a process or through decomposition by some soil microorganisms. So you can see the leaves, which are the biotic components, when they decay or they fall to the ground and decay, they release nutrients, which are abiotic components, to the soil. Okay, now let's look at another interaction of the biotic and abiotic components as regards the rainforest or savanna. Of course, the rainforest has the living components and the non-living components interacting together. So in this case, the rainforest covers various parts of the country: Oyo, Edo, Imo State, Cross River State, Ogun, Ondo, and River States. These various states fall under the rainforest vegetation. And now the savanna falls under, which is also called the tropical grassland, falls under the northern parts of the country. So we're going to look at the interactions, but before we do that, I want to also let you know that this savanna region has 3 major belts, which are called the Guinea savanna, the Sudan savanna, and the Sahel savanna. Now, what is the interaction in the rainforest or the savanna belt or region? Here we have the trees provide fresh oxygen, or the release of oxygen, which the animals make use of, and the grasses in the savanna region or savanna grassland helps to provide pasture for the animals. So that's an interaction. Then the animals feed on the plants and the fruits to obtain their fruit, while the dung or the droppings gotten from the animals serve as a form of nutrients to the soil. Then we also have the plants obtaining nutrients and water from the soil to enable them grow. The plants and the animals also respire, and in the process they release carbon dioxide to the environment, which the plants use to carry out photosynthesis. Now, sunlight from the atmosphere is also used by the green plants to carry out photosynthesis. The sunlight is an abiotic factor, while the green plants is a biotic factor, so I believe we should understand when I'm mentioning these various relationships. So the sunlight from the atmosphere is used by the green plants to manufacture their food during photosynthesis, while the plants also release oxygen into the environment, which is now used up by the animals. Okay, so we need to just have a recap. We've learned quite a lot today, so let's just have a recap on what we've learned so far. So in this lesson, we talked about agricultural ecology, which has to do with the study of plants and animals in the environment. We also talked about basic ecological concepts, which has to do with population, the community, habitat, and biosphere. We defined these various ecological concepts. We also talked about the aquatic habitat as a water-dwelling habitat and the terrestrial habitat as a land-dwelling habitat. We also talked about the components of the ecosystem, which has to do with the biotic component as a living, which has to do with living things, and the abiotic components, which has to do with the non-living aspect of the environment. So thank you so much for listening. So let's just go through some questions. Okay, so we're going to look at the year 2019, and this question says, a biotic factor affecting agricultural production is A, rainfall, B, predator, C, humidity, D, temperature. The answer should be predator. That has to do with the living factor, the living components. The others are non-living. So let's go to another question. It said, the growing of only one crop on a piece of land from year to year is known as, we talked about this in the course of the class, or the course of teaching this topic, A, mixed cropping, B, crop rotation, C, monoculture, D, shifted cultivation. I told you that monocropping can also be monoculture, especially when the crop is being repeated year after year. So the answer is C, monoculture. We have another question to answer. And this question says, vegetative growth in a fish pond, A, makes fish movement easy, B, regulates water acidity, C, increases pond water turbidity, and D, moderates pond temperature. Remember when I was talking about in a fish pond, the interaction between the living components and the non-living components, I mentioned that the fish droppings and dung can help vegetation, which helps to control or moderate pond temperature. So the answer is C. So now let's go to 2017 and answer some more questions. 2017. This question says, the following are climatic factors affecting agricultural production except, remember the climatic factors falls under the abiotic components, which are the non-living components, and I mentioned some climatic factors. So here they said rainfall, the following are climatic factors affecting agricultural production except, so rainfall is rainfall, A, B, relative humidity, C, temperature, D, topography. So topography is an edaphic factor, not a climatic factor. So the answer is D. So let's go to 2015 and answer another question. This question says, the effect of fertilizing a fish pond with compost manure or phytoplanktons. The effect of fertilizing a fish pond with compost manure on phytoplanktons, which are microscopic plants or microalgae, population and fish yield is such that the effect of fertilizing a fish pond with compost manure on phytoplankton population and fish yield is such that A, phytoplankton population decreases as fish yield decreases. Remember, the phytoplankton has to do with microscopic plants. Then B option is phytoplankton population decreases while fish yield increases. No. C, phytoplankton population increases while fish yield decreases. And the phytoplankton population increases as fish yield increases. The answer is D. Thank you for participating in today's class. You can practice more questions using the ExamGuide app. The app scores and gives a detailed explanation of all the questions at the end of your practice test. You can learn a particular topic of interest with different modes like study mode, mock mode, and practice mode. It also has other features that make learning fun. It is a must-have for all serious students. Download from www.examguide.com if you don't have it yet. See you in the next class. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share the video to people that would benefit from it.